When Hyperlight Breaker was announced a few years ago, I was pretty hyped. So, when the game released in early access last week, you can bet your ass that I decided to give it a try. I really wish I would have waited. That might seem harsh, but I really want this game to be good, and I think it has potential to be good. As a guy who's played like half of Hyperlight Drifter, Heart Machine's first game, I was pretty excited to try the prequel to that game, even if the prequel is very different. Hyperlight Drifter always gave me some like nostalgic top-down Zelda vibes, but once you look into it, it really doesn't share a lot in common with Zelda. In fact, the only thing that it has in common with Zelda really is its protagonist uses a sword, I guess. Otherwise, it's more or less closer to a retro Souls-like. What I played of Hyperlight Drifter wasn't super difficult, but it definitely wasn't easy. The only reason I never finished it is because I have ADD and get easily distracted. Hyperlight Breaker, on the other hand, is an amalgamation of a light Souls-like action combat combined with Risk of Rain 2's escalating difficulty. Now, you might be thinking, nerd, how the hell does that work? Well, it doesn't. At least not really well. Before we get too negative, let's break into this Hyperlight Breaker impressions with some positives. Aesthetically speaking, Hyperlight Breaker looks just like how I'd imagine the World of Light to look in 3D. We have weird monolithic buildings, postmodern architecture, cubes, weird-ass looking trees, bigger cubes. It's all here in a cel-shaded package. The character designs are okay. As you all know, I'm not a fan of furry-centric or furry-adjacent shit. But if the media is quality, I'll look past it. Which is exactly why I will never watch Hell of a Boss. There are currently 3 playable characters: Cat Guy, Cat Girl, and Owl Man. Their designs are fine. I'm a little disappointed that 2 of the 3 characters look so very similar to one another. Heart Machine had options. I mean, look at this wonderful wallpaper they have on their official website. You got this robot dude over here, and this plague doctor thing over here. They had options, they just chose not to use it. And I honestly can't tell you why. Variety is the spice of life, and I would know all about spice. I'm white. Moving on to the music, what's here I like. There's not a lot of it, as it's much more of an ambient soundtrack than a traditional one. Here, why don't you just listen to it? It's kind of hard to get into the story of Hyper Light Breaker, as it's very open-ended and there is no actual dialogue in this game. In fact, other than the tutorials and UI, there's no text whatsoever. It's all been told through visuals you can unlock as you play through the game. These visuals are also up to interpretation, as they are not ultra specific. Let's go over one of them with my own expert interpretation.
I have no idea what's going on.
Getting into some actual gameplay here, I mentioned the 3 playable characters. They aren't very unique to one another aside from design. There's also a class system that's implemented using something called Psychons. It boils down to starting equipment and stats, as well as a passive. It should be noted that equipment, therefore movesets, aren't locked to characters or their Psychons. By the way, the starting gear only consists of a blade, the term for a melee weapon. The rail, aka gun, will have to be found either down in the overgrowth or purchased from the store. Editing nerd here, this changed in a recent patch. Speaking of the overgrowth, let's discuss the overall progression of a cycle. Cycles are basically a game session. Each cycle has a unique, randomly generated world, featuring randomized loot, unique biomes, and 3 bosses amongst other things. It's really interesting. The goal of Hyper Light Breaker is to eliminate all of the bosses, aka crowns, and then fight the Abyss King. So, the player drops into the overgrowth where they can gather better weapons and hollow bites, maybe grab a prism, which is required to unlock crown fights, then extract. Now, before I forget, hollow bites are passive perks that the player can slot into their loadout. Each player, I think, has like 5 or 6 slots available. And most of these hollow bites, they tend to be specific toward like a weapon category. There are some general hollow bites, but I found them a lot less frequently, or maybe I just use them a lot less frequently. If the player extracts, they keep all the gear they found during their time in the overgrowth. If they die, the gear loses a point of durability. If the gear hits 0 durability, it is lost. It also will cost the player one of their 4 lives. Every time the player runs out of all of their lives, the world will need to be reset. This also gives the player a chance to earn golden rations, which is one of many meta progression currencies. It's a pretty interesting mechanic. It's definitely not perfect. Sometimes the world sculpting is off and the player will get stuck on nothing, or certain interactables won't activate. Then there's the fact that you have to die to make any real progress, therefore lose some of the items you got, just so you can rebuild the world and hopefully get better shit. Alright, let's talk about the combat of Hyper Light Breaker. As stated before, the combat is a mixture of 2 incredibly different design philosophies. The typical Souls-like combat that requires a strict understanding of enemy telegraphing, movesets, arenas, and timing. And more shit, I guess. Whilst also having the chaotic difficulty progression of Risk of Rain 2, where the rate of mob spawns steadily increases over time. Unfortunately, in the case of Hyper Light Breaker, much like Rosie O'Donnell's cholesterol, the rate of mob spawns is too damn high. I won't lie, the first hour of this game made me want to kill myself.
So babe, how are you liking the game so far?
I'm gonna kill myself.
It is a slog. You feel like you're not making any progress at all. All of the enemy groups can easily overpower you if you're not absurdly cautious, and everything you find in the overgrowth is shit. Eventually, you'll come to the conclusion that you should cache whatever trash gear you find and equip the highest rarity hollow bite, so when you go back to the hub world, you can just sell it to some random asshole. Now you can buy a purple weapon from a vendor, cause you sure as shit won't be finding one of those in the overgrowth. Even then, the player still has to unlock the rail vendor, especially if they're struggling to find and hold on to one they find in the wild. Because for some reason, the devs decided that a gray rail shouldn't be part of your initial kit, even though the character you start as gets bonuses from using rails. Make it make sense. Editing nerd here. Heart Machine did make it make sense, because like I said before, they added a default rail for each character in a recent patch. Paired with those problems, players have an incredibly limited health pool, as well as healing opportunities. Aside from a rare health drop or med flower, both of which give you fuck all health, there is the med kit, which you don't get until you upgrade your character. To add on to that, medkits also don't necessarily refill each run. Instead, you have to get at least 3 med flowers and did not use them. Alright, so 2 days before this video went live, Heart Machine released a patch that completely reworks the metagem system. And that's great because it shows that they're listening to their player base. The other option is to perfect parry, which will restore a portion of your red health, which is actually a system I like. The problem arises when the game starts to spawn 5 to 8 enemies every 15 seconds that all attack you from various angles, several of which are off screen at the same time. It makes perfect parrying, an already difficult thing to do, a hell of a lot more difficult. I won't lie, there is an indicator for off-screen attacks, but it's not very reliable. On top of that, many of the smaller mobs don't have well-telegraphed attacks, and they wind up doing more damage than the larger, easier-to-predict mobs. This isn't as much of an issue at the start of a round, but there is the difficulty progression system. The difficulty progression system exists to force players to extract when things get too dicey. I want to explore this world and look for secrets and learn to engage in combat better, but I'm not given an opportunity to do so for any reasonable amount of time because of this goddamn danger bar. It goes up too fucking fast. This escalation doesn't go up based on a timer. It's actually based on how active you are in the world. So as you kill enemies or you pick up loot, the escalation increases. The problem is once you start doing anything, it just starts to snowball so fast. It gets to a point where you just want to grab 1 or 2 things and bail. Also, it should be noted that the escalation or danger bar resets every time you die or extract. The game's combat is really fun when you're fighting 2 or 3 guys, or like 2 guys and a big dude, but you just don't have the tools at your disposal to deal with 6 of them simultaneously. And that's a pretty common situation. All of this makes the opening hours of Hyperlight Breaker one of the most frustrating experiences I've had in gaming in a long time. But it does actually get fun down the line. Once you get better equipment, once you figure out which fights you should engage in and which fights you shouldn't, when you figure out when to extract, and most importantly, when you purchase the ability to heal. It still suffers from the problems I mentioned previously, and I'll be honest with you, I feel like having a game take so long to become enjoyable is probably not a great option, but it is what it is. Now, there is one way to mitigate a lot of the problems I just mentioned, and that's playing this game in co-op. Simply having another person in the game to draw aggro makes a lot of overwhelming situations a lot more bearable. In fact, I would argue that the game is built around the idea of co-op, and the single player almost feels like it's an afterthought. Multiplayer doesn't fix everything. In fact, the performance tanks because the escalation of difficulty goes up even faster than before. So that's still a problem, but it's a lot less maddeningly difficult, and admittedly, a lot more fun. On to the technical side of combat, well, it's not super great either. Sometimes a soldier will shoot you through a wall, or an enemy will be invisible to one of the players. Sometimes the dodge works, sometimes it doesn't. The wolf's heads up circle will move halfway through the animation. Expanding upon that is the performance issues I touched on earlier. The longer you play, the choppier it gets. Even after leaving the overgrowth, the frame rate sometimes does not recover. There are also plenty of other bugs and issues. I think the turtles are like the enemies I kind of maybe hate the most. Are you fucking kidding me, dude? Game is encountered a fate. I swear to God, if I lose my equipment because of that, if I take damage for my fucking equipment because of this, I'm gonna be fucking livid. Preemptively turn. I'm not gonna scream, I promise.
2 seconds later.
God fucking damn it! A particularly nasty bug is the one that turns your weapon into a level 1 gray weapon upon returning from a run. And that's really, really, really bad because gray weapons are fucking garbage. A less detrimental bug was getting 4 players in a run rather than the 3-player maximum. Please, for the love of God, make this a feature. I know that Apex Legends popularized the 3-person party, but Apex Legends also ruined Titanfall and made gaming worse. I realize this is an early access game, and I may have sounded incredibly negative, but I say this because I want this game to be good. And I actually could foresee a reality where these things do work in tandem if the devs are willing to alter certain aspects. I have a few ideas myself on things they could change, but you're not here to watch my fat ass armchair dev. That brings us to our final point, the financial situation at Heart Machine and whether this game will make it to 1.0 or not. There was a round of layoffs in November of last year, and they started a Patreon for the company. I can't say I'm too inspired by this turn of events, and it tells me that they are indeed hurting for money. Logically, when a studio hurts for money, things tend to get rushed or outright canceled. I did speak to a Heart Machine community manager who did state that most of the early access content is complete, minus some refinement and polish. I'm not trying to be like a negative Nancy or naysayer here. This is just something you need to take into account as a consumer. Anyone that has played this game longer than 3 hours could tell you that I'm really only scratching the surface of this game. I haven't even mentioned the Psycon system, which is basically your classes, or the amps, which are another active ability each player can activate. I just feel like if I continue going, it just is going to take forever to do this video. Also, I've already filmed this like 3 times, and I've had to do it again, and I don't want to film this a 4th time. Hyperlight Breaker is really unique in what it's trying to accomplish, being a randomly generated open-world co-op roguelike. However, in this undertaking, there are some massive flaws, some of which will be easier to fix than others, and that's fine. It's an early access game. An early access game that needs a fuck ton of work. I really like the ideas that have been put forth by Hyperlight Breaker, but at the same time, I think it's a game that most people should wait a year and see how it's going before they invest $30 into it. The first few hours suck ass. It does eventually get enjoyable, but even then, it still is buggy and janky. As always, if you're interested in the game, I will have a link to the Steam page in the description below. As for me, I'm going to leave now.